After raising a wolf from a cub, Jacob Harris ventures into the wilderness to find the creature he once called family, only to discover that the wild has transformed Shadow into something unrecognizable and dangerous. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Can Jacob reconnect with the animal he loved, or will the forest claim both their lives? Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The air was thick with tension as Yusuf Qadir walked the narrow alley that led home, his thoughts clouded by the day's events. He had lived in this neighborhood for nearly a decade, a small Muslim community nestled on the edge of the city. Most days, Yusuf felt the familiar peace of his surroundings, the low hum of daily life, the gentle wave of faces he had come to know over time. But today, something felt different. A sense of unease lingered like a shadow, following him every step of the way. Yusuf could sense it before he even turned the corner, the eyes on him. The glare of strangers, the murmurs in passing. He had become accustomed to these subtle forms of discrimination, those silent, hostile moments that seemed to come with being Muslim in a predominantly white neighborhood. Yet, today, it felt sharper, more pronounced. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed people crossing the street to avoid him, or the occasional insult muttered under someone's breath. But today, the animosity felt closer, more dangerous. As he adjusted his coat against the chill, Yusuf tried to shake off the feeling, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. He had barely made it past the corner when the loud screech of a car's tires caught his attention. He didn't need to look, he could feel the eyes on him before the car even stopped. The door slammed open, and a man, tall and muscular, with a face full of anger and hatred, stepped out. Yusuf's heart skipped a beat. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. This man was not one of the usual faces he encountered, the ones who, with a mere glance, let their prejudices show through. This man was different. His posture, the way he stood, the way his eyes burned with rage, it all screamed something much more dangerous. Yusuf hesitated, but it was too late. The man was already crossing the street toward him. "Hey, you," the man barked, his voice thick with contempt. Yusuf instinctively took a step back, his hands tensing by his sides. He had been trained for moments like these, to remain calm and walk away. But something about this moment felt different. The man was too close, his presence too overwhelming. And his words, though laced with venom, had an edge to them, like he had something to prove. The words were slurred and heavy, tinged with an unmistakable hate. "What are you doing in my neighborhood, terrorist?" The question, loaded with hate, was not a question at all. It was a command, a challenge, a declaration of his intent. Yusuf's breath caught in his throat as he struggled to keep his composure. "I'm just walking home," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But the man wasn't listening. He was already stepping closer, his face twisted with disgust. "Walking home? Is that what you call it? People like you don't belong here. We don't want your kind around." Each word felt like a blow to Yusuf's chest, a constant reminder of the burden he carried as a Muslim living in a world where his faith was a target for so many. He could feel the sting of it in his bones, the weight of the anger this man had toward him simply because of what he believed. But this was no ordinary encounter. Yusuf could sense the violence in the air, like a storm on the horizon, brewing with each hateful word. He had encountered prejudice before, but this man was different. He was not just another passerby muttering an insult. No, this man had something in his eyes, something more dangerous. Yusuf's heart raced as he tried to decide what to do next. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to avoid confrontation at all costs. But the way the man was advancing, his fists clenched, his chest puffed out, it was clear that wasn't an option. The man was seeking a fight, and Yusuf could see it in his body language, hear it in the venom that dripped from his words. For a moment, Yusuf thought about the countless stories he had heard, the news reports about attacks on people like him. There had been others, men and women, who had been targeted simply because they were Muslim. He knew what this could lead to. He could already hear the whispers in the background, the subtle threats that had been spoken in private, the ones he had pushed out of his mind. But now, in this moment, they felt real, like a terrifying prophecy he couldn't escape. "You Muslims think you can just come here and take over. I won't let you," the man spat, stepping even closer. Yusuf's pulse quickened, his hands shaking now. He could feel the anger radiating off the man, his hostility almost palpable in the cold air. This wasn't just a random act of hatred, it was personal. This man was treating him not as a person, but as a symbol of everything he despised. A target. Yusuf's throat went dry, and he fought to steady his breath. He wanted to yell back, to tell the man to leave him alone, but he knew better. He had seen what happened when people gave in to their anger. He had seen the headlines of people getting hurt, or worse. This man, filled with so much hatred, was more than capable of hurting him. Yusuf couldn't let his emotions take over. He couldn't give this man the satisfaction. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to back away. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to go home," Yusuf said, his voice calm but firm. The man, however, wasn't done. "Home," he laughed, a cold, mocking laugh. "This isn't your home. You're nothing but a parasite in our country." The words stung, and Yusuf felt the weight of them sink deep into his chest. He had spent years working, contributing to the community, doing everything right. Yet, to this man, he was nothing but a foreigner, an outsider. "You need to leave before I make you leave," the man warned, his voice growing darker. Yusuf's eyes darted around, searching for any way out. The street was empty, the quiet of the neighborhood broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat. The man was too close now, and Yusuf felt trapped. He could see the anger in the man's face, the way his fists were tightening. His body tensed, ready for something more. It was only then that Yusuf realized how dangerous this situation truly was. He had tried to remain calm, to reason with the man. But reason no longer seemed to be an option. The man was intent on making his hatred known, and Yusuf was standing in his way. The realization hit him hard, like a wave crashing against the shore. This wasn't just a disagreement, this was a threat to his safety. He could feel it now, the urgency to get away, to escape before things escalated further. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, his mind racing with possibilities. What should he do? Should he call for help? Should he try to run? But the man wasn't giving him a chance. Before he could make a decision, the man lunged forward. His large hand grabbed Yusuf by the collar, pulling him toward him. The world seemed to slow as Yusuf's breath caught in his throat. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was it. The moment he had feared was happening. The man's eyes were full of hate, his grip tight and unforgiving. And in that instant, Yusuf knew he was no longer just a man walking home. He was a target. A victim. A symbol of everything this man despised. With the man's fist raised, Yusuf braced himself for the blow that was about to come. The world around him seemed to blur, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered how it had all come to this. Jacob stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the forest. His heart hammered in his chest as the chill of the evening air seeped into his bones. It had been years since he last set foot in this forest, and even though the trees around him had remained largely unchanged, something about the place felt foreign. The soft rustling of the wind in the leaves seemed to carry whispers of a time long gone, a time when Shadow was still a cub, a time when the world felt simpler. But now, everything had shifted. The innocence of those days felt distant, a memory slowly fading as the wild had taken root in the wolf he had raised. Jacob took a deep breath, his pulse quickening as he caught sight of fresh tracks in the dirt, a sign that Shadow had been here recently. The tracks were deep and wide, showing signs of strength and wildness. This wasn't the same wolf he had raised with care, trained with patience. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in his world anymore. He crouched down, running his fingers lightly over the earth, studying the prints. His mind raced. What had happened to Shadow during the years they'd been apart? Jacob had never imagined this day would come, the day when he would have to confront the beast that was once a loyal companion. The warnings from the townspeople echoed in his mind. You can't tame the wild, they'd said. Shadow's no longer the pup you raised. He's not the same creature. Jacob had tried to push those thoughts aside. How could they be right? How could Shadow, his loyal companion, turn into something unrecognizable? But the tracks in the dirt, the unsettling feeling in his gut, everything was pointing to the truth. Shadow was gone. The wild had taken him, and Jacob didn't know if he could get him back. He stood up slowly, glancing around. The forest felt oppressive now, the trees closing in on him, their shadows stretching long into the dusk. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. His eyes flickered to the trail ahead, the path where Shadow had walked, and his feet instinctively began to move. His mind was set. He had to find Shadow, no matter the cost. As Jacob made his way deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, heavier. The further he ventured, the more isolated he felt, as though the world had shrunk around him. It wasn't just the forest that had changed, it was him, too. He was no longer the same man who had raised Shadow, the young man who had been filled with hope and ambition. Time had weathered him. And now, as he walked deeper into the woods, he realized that he was seeking something he wasn't sure he could find anymore, a connection to a past he wasn't sure he could return to. The sky above had darkened, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long, their branches creaking with each gust of wind. Jacob's thoughts turned to the day Shadow had disappeared. It had been sudden, without warning. One moment, they were together, playing by the river, and the next, Shadow had run off into the forest. Jacob had searched for days, calling out the wolf's name, hoping that his loyal companion would return, but he never did. In the years since, Jacob had tried to move on. He had gotten a job, made a life for himself, but there was always a part of him that remained tethered to the memory of the wolf. He couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow was out there, somewhere, waiting for him to find him again. The bond they had shared was too strong, too real. It wasn't something that could simply vanish. But now, as he trudged through the underbrush, the weight of his past pressed heavily on him. He wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he had to try. For himself. For Shadow. The air around him shifted suddenly, and a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, sending a shiver down Jacob's spine. It was the kind of wind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that made you feel as if something was watching you. Jacob stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The sound of the wind seemed to carry a low, mournful growl in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. Jacob's legs moved instinctively as he followed the sound. The growl was faint at first, but it grew louder with each step. It was unmistakable now. It was the sound of a wolf. Shadow was out there, waiting for him. He broke into a run, adrenaline surging through his veins. The path before him blurred as he focused on the growl, the only thing that mattered now. He couldn't let Shadow slip away again. Not after all these years. As Jacob moved through the dense trees, the growl grew louder, closer. He could feel his pulse in his ears, pounding with the rhythm of his footsteps. The ground beneath him was soft and uneven, but he didn't care. He pushed forward, determined. He needed to see Shadow again, to know if the wolf still remembered him, to understand what had happened to him all these years. Then, out of nowhere, the growl stopped. Jacob skidded to a halt, his heart racing. The silence that followed was almost deafening. It felt as though the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. Jacob's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows, but all he saw were the towering trees and the flickering remnants of daylight. And then he heard it. A rustling from the bushes to his left. Jacob turned just in time to see a flash of movement, a wolf, large and powerful, stepping into the clearing. The wolf's fur was matted and tangled, its body lean and muscular. Its amber eyes locked onto Jacob's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. It was Shadow. But the wolf that stood before him wasn't the same creature that had followed him around as a cub. This Shadow was wild, untamed, his eyes filled with wariness and caution. His once playful nature had been replaced with a sharp, predatory instinct. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He could see the recognition in Shadow's eyes, but it wasn't the warmth he remembered. It was a cold, calculating look, as though the wolf was trying to decide if Jacob was a friend or a foe. The bond they once shared was still there, but it was strained, fractured by years of separation. Jacob took a step forward, his heart pounding. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me. It's Jacob." For a moment, the wolf didn't move. Its eyes flickered from Jacob's face to his outstretched hand. Jacob's heart swelled with hope. Maybe Shadow still remembered him. Maybe there was a chance to reconnect, to bring the wolf he raised back into his life. But then, without warning, Shadow growled. The sound was deep and guttural, a warning. Jacob froze, his hand still outstretched. The wolf wasn't ready to trust him. A surge of fear rushed through Jacob's chest, but he refused to back down. He couldn't. This was his chance. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Shadow," he said again, softer this time. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to see you again." But the wolf only took a step back, its eyes still fixed on Jacob. The space between them grew, and Jacob's heart sank. He realized, in that moment, that Shadow was not the same animal he had once raised. The wild had claimed him, and no matter how much Jacob wanted to believe otherwise, the wolf was no longer his to command. Shadow was no longer a pet. He was a creature of the forest. And in this forest, Jacob was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. With one final growl, Shadow turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jacob standing alone in the clearing, the echoes of his past fading into the night. The growl echoed through the dense forest, an unsettling sound that seemed to vibrate through Jacob's very bones. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He stopped dead in his tracks, instinctively freezing as his heart raced. It was close, closer than he had expected. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wet fur and earth, mixed with something far more dangerous. The hairs on his arms prickled, his mind filled with the warnings he had heard just hours ago. "Stay away from the forest, Jacob. Don't go looking for that wolf. It's not the same anymore." But here he was, stepping into the heart of the wilderness, where everything he had known as a child seemed to be fading with every footstep. The place where he had raised Shadow, the wolf cub who had once trusted him more than anything, was now a forest of shadows and fear. Jacob squinted into the dimming light, trying to make sense of the noise. His breath caught when the underbrush in front of him shifted, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shape moving swiftly through the trees. It was too large to be any other animal he could think of, and yet it didn't feel like the wolf he remembered. The wolf he had raised. This was something else. A part of Jacob wanted to turn back. To heed the advice of the stranger from earlier, to admit that he had made a mistake in coming here. But another part of him, something deep inside, told him that he needed to face this. He needed to see the creature he had once called his friend, to see what had become of Shadow. Another growl rippled through the air. This time, it wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Jacob's feet shuffled against the forest floor as he slowly advanced. His mind raced with memories, images of the young cub he had found all those years ago. The small, helpless creature had fit into his arms, and Jacob had nurtured it, fed it, raised it like a brother. Shadow had grown strong, loyal. He had even saved Jacob's life once, back when the forest had been their home. But now, Shadow was different. He wasn't a cub anymore. And Jacob feared he wasn't even the same wolf he had once known. The growl came again, closer this time. Jacob stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat as he saw movement ahead. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a massive figure, its eyes glowing amber in the fading light. The wolf. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The animal he had raised, the animal he had loved, was standing before him, but it was no longer the wolf cub he had cared for. This creature was larger, fiercer, with fur matted and tangled, like it had been living in the wild for far too long. The once gentle features had been replaced with a hard, menacing stare. Shadow's eyes met Jacob's, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Jacob stood still, watching, hoping for a spark of recognition. But all he saw was cold, unblinking intensity. "Shadow," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's me, it's Jacob." The wolf didn't move. It only stared at him, unblinking. The air between them was thick with tension. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, a sick feeling rising in his stomach. He wasn't sure if he should take a step forward or run. The wolf had been his companion once, but now? Now, it was a dangerous predator, no longer tamed, no longer the animal he had raised. For a long, agonizing moment, the wolf did nothing. It simply stood there, watching Jacob. The wind rustled through the trees, the sounds of the forest alive around them, but the two of them remained locked in a silent battle. Jacob's hand hovered near his side, instinctively reaching for the small hunting knife he had brought with him, though he knew it wouldn't help against something like this. His mind raced as he tried to think of something to say, something that would remind the wolf of the bond they had once shared. But the words didn't come. Then, without warning, the wolf snarled, the sound low and guttural. It was a warning, but Jacob didn't know what it meant. Was it a sign to leave? Or was it a sign to stay? "Shadow," Jacob said again, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and longing. "I'm not here to hurt you." But the wolf didn't respond. Instead, it let out another growl, this one louder and more menacing, its lips curling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. Jacob's heart pounded faster, and his instinct told him to take a step back. He didn't know what had happened to Shadow in all these years, but whatever it was, the bond they had shared was no longer there. The wolf took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes never leaving Jacob's. For a brief moment, it seemed to hesitate, then it lunged. Jacob barely had time to react. He sidestepped quickly, his pulse racing as he felt the air from the wolf's fur brushing against him. The force of the wolf's jump was enough to send Jacob stumbling backward, his foot catching on a root in the ground. He crashed to the forest floor, his heart hammering in his chest. He barely managed to scramble to his feet before the wolf turned, circling around him like a predator sizing up its prey. It was hunting him now. Jacob's breaths came in ragged gasps as he tried to regain his balance, his mind spinning. He had to think fast. He wasn't prepared for this. The wolf was too fast, too strong. He could barely keep up, let alone get away. "Shadow," Jacob called out again, his voice desperate. "Please, it's me. I'm not here to hurt you." But the wolf didn't stop. It wasn't listening. It didn't care. It was no longer the animal he had raised. It was a creature of the wild, fighting for survival. And Jacob was the intruder in its domain. The wolf stopped circling for a brief moment, its eyes narrowing as it studied Jacob. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged again. This time, Jacob was ready. He twisted to the side just as the wolf's jaws snapped shut, missing him by inches. His breath caught in his throat as he stumbled away, his heart in his throat. But the wolf wasn't done. It growled again, louder this time, its deep voice vibrating through the forest. Jacob's legs were already aching, his body growing tired from the constant movement, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He had to survive. Another lunge. Another snap of the jaws. Jacob ducked just in time, rolling to the side. The wolf landed where he had been just seconds before, its claws scraping against the ground. For the first time since this encounter began, Jacob realized the truth. He wasn't dealing with the wolf he had raised. He was dealing with something else. Something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable. And in that moment, Jacob understood, Shadow wasn't just a wild animal anymore. Shadow was a predator. As Jacob stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the slick forest floor, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Through the trees ahead, he caught a glimpse of another set of eyes, eyes watching, waiting. The wolf wasn't alone. Jacob's legs trembled with uncertainty as he walked deeper into the forest. The trees, tall and unyielding, closed in around him like silent sentinels watching his every move. The air felt thicker here, colder, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every snap of a twig underfoot made Jacob wince, his mind alert to every noise, every shift in the breeze. The old instincts he had learned during the years spent with Shadow were still there, but they didn't help him now. Shadow was not the same wolf anymore. He had become something else, something wild. It had been days since Jacob had first ventured into the forest, drawn by the memories of the wolf he once raised with his own hands. Shadow, the wolf cub who had been nothing more than a helpless creature when Jacob first found him, had grown into something untamable. Something that could no longer be trusted. The forest, once a place of solace and companionship, now felt like a cage. As Jacob walked on, he thought back to the conversations with the locals, people who had warned him to stay away from the wolf, to let it go. They said that time had changed Shadow, that he wasn't the same animal Jacob had raised all those years ago. The wolf you knew doesn't exist anymore, one of them had told him, his eyes wide with fear. It's no longer tame. It's part of the wild now. But Jacob couldn't bring himself to believe that. He had raised Shadow from a helpless cub, and no matter what anyone said, there had to be something of the old wolf left inside him. Didn't there? He couldn't shake the thought that the bond they had shared, the bond that had been forged through so much, still existed, buried deep within the wild creature Shadow had become. A low growl suddenly echoed from the shadows, pulling Jacob out of his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. That sound, it was unmistakable. It was the growl of a wolf, but not just any wolf. It was Shadow. The hair on the back of Jacob's neck stood up. He slowly turned his head, scanning the darkened edges of the forest, searching for any sign of movement. His breath hitched in his throat. Was it really him? Was it the wolf he had raised? Or was it something else entirely? Something darker? Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he took a slow step forward, his footfalls quiet against the soft earth. He couldn't afford to make a sound. Every sense in his body screamed at him to turn back, to leave the forest and never look back, but he couldn't. He had come too far to stop now. He had to know the truth. He had to know what Shadow had become. The growl grew louder, closer, the tension thickening in the air. Jacob's mind raced, but his body stayed still, every fiber of his being focused on the sound. The forest had gone eerily silent around him, as if the creatures of the woods themselves had frozen in place. Suddenly, a pair of glowing amber eyes pierced the darkness. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. There it was, Shadow. But the wolf that stood before him was not the same animal he had known. Shadow's fur was matted and unkempt, his once sleek coat now tangled and wild. His eyes, which had once shone with warmth and trust, were now cold and calculating, filled with suspicion and distrust. The wolf was massive, his muscles rippling beneath his fur, a predator in every sense of the word. Jacob's heart sank. This wasn't the gentle creature he had raised. This was something else entirely. The wolf's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a warning. Jacob took a step back, but Shadow didn't move. He only stared at him, his eyes locked onto Jacob's with an intensity that made the air between them feel thick with tension. For a moment, Jacob thought he saw something in those eyes, something familiar, something he had been desperately searching for. It was like a flicker of recognition, a brief moment of clarity, before the wolf's gaze turned cold again. Jacob's chest tightened. This wasn't just about finding the wolf. This was about confronting everything he had tried to bury, the bond they once shared, the years that had passed, and the monster that Shadow had become. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. Shadow. He whispered, his voice hoarse. It's me. Jacob. Do you remember me? The wolf's ears twitched, but there was no sign of recognition. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Shadow remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Jacob, but there was no warmth in them, only a cold, predatory gaze. The bond that once existed between them felt distant, like it had been severed long ago. Jacob's heart clenched. Had Shadow really forgotten him? Or had the forest done this to him? Had it twisted the wolf into something unrecognizable? The growl grew louder, and the wolf took a step forward, its body low to the ground, muscles tense and coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jacob's breath quickened. The wolf was ready to attack. A surge of fear gripped Jacob's chest, but he refused to run. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had been through to find Shadow again. He wasn't going to let the wolf slip away into the forest without a fight. Not when there was still a chance to bring him back. He had to try. Shadow, Jacob said again, his voice stronger this time. It's me. It's Jacob. I raised you. Don't you remember? The wolf's lips curled back, revealing sharp, white teeth. The growl deepened into a low, menacing snarl. Shadow was not backing down. He was not the wolf Jacob had raised. He was something else, something fierce, something untamed. Jacob's mind raced, but his body remained still. He had no choice but to face the wolf. He had to show Shadow that he was still the same person. Maybe, just maybe, that old bond could be rekindled. But as the wolf moved closer, the air around them thickened with danger. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to move, to get out of the way, but he stood his ground. He couldn't give up now. He wouldn't. Suddenly, the wolf lunged, closing the distance between them in a flash. Jacob barely had time to react as the wolf's teeth snapped just inches from his arm. The force of the attack sent Jacob stumbling backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely caught his balance, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had feared. Shadow wasn't the same. He wasn't the gentle wolf anymore. He was a wild animal, and Jacob was just another threat in his eyes. Jacob's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. The wolf had given him a warning that would have been wise to heed. But it was too late for that now. Jacob knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this end in violence. He couldn't let Shadow become another lost creature of the forest. Shadow, stop! Jacob shouted, his voice trembling with both fear and determination. You don't have to do this. I'm not a threat. The wolf paused, its amber eyes narrowing as it studied Jacob. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jacob's heart raced, the silence between them deafening. Could Shadow hear him? Could he understand? Was there still a chance to save him? But before Jacob could make another move, a sudden rustling from behind him shattered the tension. The sound of something large moving through the brush reached his ears, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone in the forest. There was someone else here, and they weren't friendly. The wolf turned its head, its gaze flicking toward the noise. Jacob followed its eyes, but he saw nothing. He didn't have time to worry about what was lurking in the shadows, though. His focus was on the wolf, the animal that had once been his companion, now a creature of the wild. But as the growls continued to echo through the forest, Jacob realized the truth: Shadow was no longer his. He had become part of the wilderness, part of something far bigger and far darker than Jacob had ever imagined. The bond they once shared was broken, and the forest had claimed the wolf as its own. Shadow's growl faded into the distance as he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jacob standing alone, his heart heavy with the loss of the creature he had once loved. The thick air of the forest pressed in around Jacob as he tried to steady his breath, his pulse racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. The growl had stopped, but the stillness that followed was far from reassuring. Instead of hearing the sound of a retreating predator, the silence hung heavy, as though the forest itself had become a witness to his struggle. Jacob's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, trying to pick out any movement, anything that might give him a clue as to what was happening just beyond his sight. The world seemed to hold its breath, and he could feel it in his gut, the tension, the uncertainty. The very ground beneath his feet felt more alive than ever before, as if it, too, had heard the warnings and felt the dangers lurking in the unknown. Then, the sound came, a snap of a twig. The unmistakable sound of a presence, someone else was out there. Who's there? Jacob's voice cracked, the question more instinctual than anything else. The tension in his voice echoed his growing unease. For a moment, nothing answered. Just more silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the wind shifting through the branches. Then, just as he was about to turn and make his way back to the clearing, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes that blended almost seamlessly with the twilight woods around them. His face was weathered, hardened by years of survival, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a worn cap. The stranger's presence was calm, almost eerie in its stillness, but it was the rifle slung across his back that sent a chill through Jacob's spine. Not wise to approach a wild wolf, kid, the man spoke, his voice deep and rough, carrying the weight of experience. He didn't raise his weapon, but Jacob could feel the invisible threat of it hanging between them. Jacob's chest tightened as his mind raced, trying to process who this man could be and why he was here. Jacob started, but the man raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. I know what you're here for, the stranger continued, his tone matter of fact. But that wolf you're looking for isn't the one you raised anymore. He's not the same. The words hung in the air like a weight too heavy to ignore. Jacob's throat tightened, the idea of his wolf, Shadow, being something so different, so much darker, unsettling him. What do you mean? Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. What happened to him? The stranger's lips curled into a grim smile. The forest changes things. Time changes things. That wolf you loved is still out there, somewhere, but it's not a pet anymore. It's a predator now. You won't find him the way you remember. He's learned the ways of the wild. Survival's all he knows now. Jacob shook his head, a knot forming in his stomach. But I raised him. I trained him. He trusted me, he said, as if speaking to himself more than the stranger. He could feel the memories flooding back, the first time he had found the wolf, so small and fragile, and the bond they had built. It felt impossible to imagine Shadow as anything but that innocent creature. The man eyed him carefully, his expression unreadable. Trust is a funny thing, he muttered. You can't force an animal to remember what it's supposed to. It does what it does to survive. That's its only job now. Jacob's mind whirled with the weight of those words. He felt helpless, lost in the midst of this forest, not knowing what was true or not. Could he really find the Shadow he knew, or was that bond gone, replaced by something more dangerous? Could he make the wolf see him again, see that he was still the same person, or had that part of their relationship been erased forever? He opened his mouth to ask another question, but the man raised a hand, silencing him. Listen, he said, his tone softening slightly, I'm not here to stop you. You're free to do what you want. But you need to understand that this isn't some fairy tale where the wolf remembers you and comes running. It's not that simple. Jacob didn't know what to say. A part of him felt betrayed by the stranger's words, but another part, deep inside, felt the truth in them. This wasn't just about reconnecting with Shadow, it was about survival, about the wild taking its toll on something once pure. He could feel the weight of the forest around him, pressing in on him from all sides. This wasn't the same world he remembered with the wolf by his side. The rules had changed, and Jacob was no longer in control. Why are you telling me all of this? Jacob asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Who are you? The stranger sighed, glancing back toward the deeper woods. I've seen wolves like him before. And I've seen people like you, people who think they can change it. The truth is, you can't. Once something becomes part of the wild, it belongs to it. And you? You're just another outsider here. Jacob's heart sank. Was he an outsider? He had spent so much of his life with Shadow, had raised him, loved him, but now, he wondered if he truly belonged in this world. The man was right. He didn't belong here, not in this place where survival was the only rule. The stranger seemed to sense Jacob's turmoil and spoke again, his voice softer this time. Look, you don't have to listen to me. You're free to try. But just remember, the wild doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care what you did, who you were. It only cares about now. The man turned, and with the rustling of leaves underfoot, he began to walk away. If you're going to find that wolf, you'll need to be smarter than you've ever been. And you'll need to let go of what you think you know. Jacob watched him go, his words lingering in the air, more haunting than anything else. What did he mean by let go of what you think you know? Jacob's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. Had the stranger really helped him, or had he just deepened the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him since he first entered these woods? The weight of the rifle across the stranger's back, the way he moved through the forest with ease, made it clear that this was not just a random encounter. This man had lived here for a long time. He had seen the changes, witnessed the cycles of life and death that came with the wild. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to understand, something he wasn't seeing. For the first time since entering the forest, Jacob felt the full force of isolation. He wasn't just disconnected from the world outside, he was disconnected from everything he thought he knew about the wolf, about the wild, and about himself. He had come here for answers, but the only thing he had found was more questions. And then, as the wind shifted, carrying the faintest whisper of something moving in the distance, Jacob knew he had to make a choice. Was he going to trust the stranger's words, or was he going to continue his search for Shadow, no matter the cost? The night had fallen thick in the woods, wrapping itself around Jacob like a suffocating blanket. The forest, once a place of comfort, now felt like a maze, an endless expanse of shadows and unknowns. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig beneath his boots, sent a ripple of anxiety through him. His heart pounded, not just from the fear of what he might find, but from the weight of the decision that had led him here. Jacob had never imagined his life would lead him back to this point. After years of raising Shadow, the wolf who had been his companion, his friend, his family, he had come to the harsh realization that the creature he loved was no longer the same. Shadow was wild, untamed, and dangerous. A force of nature that could not be controlled. And tonight, as he ventured deeper into the forest to confront the animal he once cared for, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into the unknown. He was no longer sure if he was the one looking for Shadow, or if Shadow had been waiting all this time to find him. Stay focused, Jacob muttered to himself, his breath visible in the cool night air. His hand gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam slicing through the darkness, revealing the twisted trunks of trees and the unfamiliar contours of the ground. The forest had changed. It wasn't just the years, it was the sense of loss, the lost connection with the creature he once loved. The warnings echoed in his mind. The words of the stranger, the man who had known the forest and its dangers, who had cautioned Jacob that Shadow was no longer a pet, kept ringing in his ears. The wolf has become something else, the man had said. Something darker. And Jacob couldn't deny it. Every encounter with Shadow since his return had proven that. The wolf didn't recognize him the way it once had. It didn't show affection or trust anymore. It was cold, calculating, and relentless. There was something inside Shadow now, something wild and untamable. But despite it all, Jacob refused to give up. He couldn't. It wasn't just about Shadow. It was about closure. It was about understanding what had happened to the animal he had raised, the animal he had loved like a child. He needed to face the truth, even if it meant facing Shadow's fury. As Jacob continued deeper into the forest, his thoughts turned to the past. The day he had first found Shadow had been one of the happiest of his life. He had been only a teenager, walking along the edge of the forest when he heard a soft whimper. What he found that day, a tiny, trembling wolf cub, had been the start of an unexpected bond. Shadow had been abandoned, weak and barely alive, but Jacob had taken him in, nurtured him, raised him with love. For years, Shadow had been his constant companion. Together, they had explored the woods, sharing moments of peaceful solitude. Jacob had taught Shadow to hunt, to follow commands, to trust. But the bond wasn't just one-sided. Shadow had, in his own way, loved Jacob. It was a love that went beyond the ordinary connection between man and animal. It was a deep, almost spiritual bond. But everything had changed the day Shadow disappeared. The day the wolf had run off into the forest without a word, without a trace, leaving Jacob standing alone on the edge of the woods. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the quiet, heart-wrenching sound of the forest swallowing him whole. For months, Jacob had searched. He had scoured every inch of the woods, hoping for a glimpse, for any sign that Shadow was still out there. But he had found nothing. Shadow had simply vanished, as if the forest had claimed him. And now, years later, here Jacob was, searching again, driven by the need to understand. What had happened to his beloved wolf? Was Shadow still in there? Or had the wild truly taken him away? The thought made his chest tighten with fear and uncertainty. And then, just as he was about to take another step, a movement in the distance caught his attention. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement between the trees, something large, something fast. Jacob's heart leapt into his throat. Was it Shadow? He stopped dead in his tracks, straining his eyes to see through the dark. The beam of the flashlight was useless now, swallowed by the forest's embrace. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the soft growl of something moving through the underbrush. And then, it happened. Out of the shadows, a pair of amber eyes gleamed back at him. The same eyes he remembered. But they were different now. There was no warmth, no familiarity. Only the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. There, standing just yards away, was Shadow. But the wolf had grown. It was bigger now, its fur matted and thick, its muscles taut and powerful. The animal's once innocent face had been replaced with something more terrifying, more primal. The wolf wasn't looking at Jacob like it once had, with recognition, with love. No, now the wolf's eyes were filled with a quiet, controlled menace. Jacob swallowed hard, his feet frozen to the spot. Shadow had grown into something monstrous. There was no trace of the wolf he had raised, the animal that used to play in the yard, who would sit beside him at night. This was a wild creature, no longer bound by the memories of their time together. And yet, despite the terror coursing through him, Jacob stepped forward. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me. Jacob." For a moment, the wolf didn't move. It only watched him, its head cocked slightly to the side, as though it was assessing him, weighing whether or not he was a threat. And then, just as Jacob dared to hope, Shadow took a step forward. Jacob's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment he had waited for. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. If Shadow could recognize him, if the bond they once shared still existed, then maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Maybe he could bring the wolf back to the creature that had loved him once. But then, without warning, Shadow bared his teeth, a deep, guttural growl escaping from his throat. It wasn't the playful growl Jacob had once known. No, this was a warning. A threat. The wolf's lips curled back, its eyes flashing with the promise of violence. Jacob stopped in his tracks. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined. The wolf wasn't here for peace. Shadow had changed, and whatever connection they once had was gone. The wild had claimed him, and now the wild was in control. Jacob's mind raced. He needed to do something, say something, that would bring this all back to safety. But what could he say? What could he do to reach the wolf who had become a force of nature, an unstoppable predator? The love he had once felt for this animal was now mingled with fear, uncertainty, and sadness. "Shadow, please," Jacob pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this. We were family. I was there for you. Please, just remember me. Remember us." The wolf's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of something, maybe recognition, maybe confusion. But before Jacob could take another step, the wolf growled again, louder this time, and lunged forward. Everything happened in a blur. Jacob stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as Shadow's massive form shot past him. The force of the wolf's movement sent him crashing to the ground. His flashlight flew out of his hand, its beam scattering across the dark forest floor. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, the sounds of the wolf's heavy breaths surrounding him. In that moment, Jacob understood the truth. The wolf was lost. Shadow was no longer the creature he had raised. The bond was gone, shattered by the wild. The forest had taken him, and there was nothing left to do but survive. As the wolf circled back, its eyes locked on him, Jacob made a decision. He would leave the forest. For good. He could never bring Shadow back. The wild had claimed its own, and there was no place for him anymore. With one last look at the wolf, Jacob turned and ran, the sound of Shadow's growl echoing behind him as he disappeared into the night. The forest was silent now, the only sound coming from the wind rustling through the trees, whispering like old secrets. Jacob stood at the edge of a clearing, staring into the shadows of the woods where he knew Shadow was watching him. His heart was pounding, an echo of the fear he had tried to ignore. The reality of the situation had fully settled in, and every instinct told him to leave. To run. To walk away and never look back. But he couldn't. He just couldn't. After everything, after all the years he had spent raising Shadow, it was impossible to turn his back on the wolf now. He had given everything to make sure that Shadow grew up safe, that it trusted him, that they would always be a team. They had been partners, in every sense of the word, in those early days when Shadow was small enough to curl up next to Jacob on the couch, when Jacob would feed it with his own hands. But that Shadow was long gone. The wolf that now haunted the forest was not the same. It was bigger. Wilder. Unpredictable. Yet, in the deepest part of his heart, Jacob knew the truth, this was still the same animal, the one he had raised. Somewhere, buried beneath the wildness, beneath the years of survival, was the Shadow he knew, the creature that had once trusted him, the animal he had taught to listen. If only he could reach that part again. Jacob took a deep breath and stepped forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. He was aware of every sound in the woods, every snap of a branch, every crunch of a leaf underfoot. He was so aware, in fact, that the feeling of being watched was becoming almost unbearable. It was as if the forest itself had its eyes on him. The growl from earlier still echoed in his ears. It wasn't a threat. Not yet. But it was a warning. Shadow was still circling, still watching, waiting to see what Jacob would do next. The first encounter had been shocking. Jacob had hoped that the wolf would recognize him, that the bond they shared would somehow transcend the years apart. But the wolf hadn't recognized him, not in the way he'd hoped. The growl, the bared teeth, the hesitation before Shadow attacked, it all told Jacob that the forest had changed Shadow, twisted it into something else. He wasn't sure if that was a permanent change, but if he didn't act soon, if he didn't try to reconnect, he might lose the chance forever. Suddenly, Jacob stopped. There, just on the other side of a thick stand of trees, he could make out two glowing eyes. Amber, like he remembered. His breath caught in his throat. Shadow had appeared again, but this time the wolf didn't growl. It didn't move forward to attack. Instead, it just stood there, watching him, a faint breeze blowing through its matted fur. Jacob's heart raced. The wolf wasn't charging. It wasn't lunging. It wasn't angry. It was simply observing. Shadow. Jacob whispered, taking a slow step forward. His voice trembled, a mixture of hope and fear. He didn't want to push too hard, but at the same time, he needed to show the wolf he wasn't a threat. I know you're still in there. I know it's you. For a moment, the wolf didn't respond. The only movement was its chest rising and falling, its eyes narrowing slightly as it continued to study Jacob. It was as if the wolf was searching him, trying to make sense of who he was, trying to recall the bond they once shared. Jacob's mind raced with memories. The days spent running through the forest with Shadow at his side. The nights they spent by the fire, with Shadow resting at Jacob's feet, warm and content. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago, and yet they were as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. Was it possible for that bond to survive? Could the creature standing in front of him remember the love they shared, or was it too far gone? As if reading his thoughts, the wolf moved. Slowly at first, its large body stepping forward with caution. Then, without warning, the animal lunged, but not at Jacob. Instead, Shadow turned and ran deeper into the forest. It was as if the wolf was inviting him to follow, daring him to chase. Jacob's mind screamed at him to stop. To be careful. But his feet were already moving, his legs carrying him forward without thought. He couldn't let Shadow get away again. He couldn't let this chance slip through his fingers. He pushed through the underbrush, his heart pounding, adrenaline flooding his veins. The forest seemed to close in around him, each branch and bush threatening to slow him down. The farther he went, the more he felt the weight of the wildness closing in. It was as though the forest itself was warning him, telling him that he wasn't welcome here anymore, that the bond he had once shared with the wolf was no longer enough. But he couldn't stop. Not now. As Jacob pushed forward, his foot caught on a hidden root, and he fell hard to the ground. His breath escaped in a rush, and for a moment, everything around him went dark. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, the pain in his knee sharp, but he didn't care. He had to get up. He had to keep going. But when he stood and wiped the dirt off his clothes, he found himself standing alone in a small clearing. The path was empty. The wolf was gone. Jacob's heart sank. It was as if Shadow had vanished into the trees, swallowed by the forest. He was alone again, left with nothing but the silence of the woods and the growing sense of dread in his chest. What had just happened? Was this some twisted game? Was Shadow truly gone, or was this just another test? A chill ran through him. He realized now that he wasn't just chasing a wild animal. He was chasing the ghost of something that no longer existed. The wolf had become something else, a creature of the forest, shaped by years of survival, no longer the loyal companion it once had been. Jacob stopped in his tracks, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. The wolf he had raised, his Shadow, wasn't lost. It had changed. The bond they shared was no longer enough to pull it back. No matter how badly Jacob wanted it, the wolf had its own path to follow now, a path that didn't include him. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He stood still, waiting. His body tense, every muscle coiled with anticipation. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt the weight of something important hanging in the air, a decision that had to be made. Then, he heard it. A low growl, deeper this time. Louder. Closer. Jacob didn't move. His breath caught in his throat. The wolf was coming back. But this time, something was different. The growl was more than a warning. It was a challenge. Shadow wasn't just running from him, it was setting the rules now. It had become the predator, and Jacob had become the prey. And just like that, everything changed. The forest was no longer a place of memories for Jacob. It had become a battleground. A place where the past and present collided, and where the wild instincts of the wolf had overtaken the bond they once shared. Jacob stood there, realizing what he had known deep down all along. He couldn't control Shadow anymore. He couldn't make it remember what it had once been. The wolf had become a force of nature, beyond his reach, beyond his understanding. It was time to make the hardest decision of all. Was he willing to keep chasing a ghost? Or was it time to let go? Jacob took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. He knew he couldn't keep chasing after Shadow forever. But as the wolf's growl echoed through the trees, he also knew that walking away was not an easy choice. Would he let the forest claim Shadow forever, or would he face the beast he had raised one last time? The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the deep, unsettling quiet that had fallen over the forest. Jacob stood still, his breath shallow, his pulse racing as he stared at the wolf, Shadow, who was no longer the creature he had raised. The distance between them felt vast, and yet the connection they once shared seemed to stretch across the years, faint but still there. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of fear, hope, and guilt flooding him. Shadow's amber eyes were locked onto Jacob's, the recognition unmistakable. For a moment, everything around them seemed to fade into the background. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the sounds of the world, the forest was alive, but Jacob and the wolf were in their own world, suspended in time. Shadow, Jacob whispered, taking a slow, cautious step forward. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to lose you. Please, come back. But the wolf didn't move. It stood tall and still, its fur matted and wild, its muscles tense. Jacob knew, deep down, that Shadow had changed in ways he couldn't fully understand. The wild had claimed him, transformed him from the loyal companion Jacob had once known into something else, something darker, something dangerous. It wasn't just the wolf that had changed, Jacob himself had been transformed by time, by loss, by the mistakes he'd made. This moment, this face-off with the creature he once cared for, was a culmination of everything that had led him here. But the question remained, could Jacob ever reclaim what was lost, or had the bond between them truly been severed? The air felt thick with anticipation. Jacob's legs trembled as he took another step forward. His hand instinctively reached out, palm open, as if to offer Shadow the comfort of a gesture he'd once known. The old bond, that silent language they'd shared, the wolf had always understood him, and Jacob had always understood the wolf. But now, as the seconds ticked by, Jacob could feel it, the wolf wasn't the same. It wasn't even close. The bond had been twisted by the wild, and the wild was not something to be reckoned with. Jacob had tried to fight it, tried to fight the reality that Shadow had grown beyond the care he had once given him. But as he stood there in the clearing, he realized something fundamental: he had to let go. Please, Jacob murmured again, his voice thick with emotion. I don't want to hurt you. I just need to know, what happened to you? For a split second, Shadow's eyes softened. It was fleeting, a mere flicker, but it was there. A reminder that deep inside, Shadow was still the wolf he had raised, the creature that had once followed him through thick and thin, the companion who had slept beside him on cold nights. But then, that softness vanished, replaced by an unsettling growl, a sound that was low and menacing. Jacob froze. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, and his hand dropped to his side. Shadow's lips curled back in a snarl, the muscles in its body coiling, ready to strike. Jacob's mind raced. He wanted to run, wanted to escape the inevitable confrontation, but he knew there was no turning back now. This was it. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He had come here seeking redemption, seeking a way to heal the bond they once shared, but now, he had to face the harsh reality. Shadow had become something else, something he couldn't control. The wild had taken him, and in return, Shadow had lost the trust he once had for Jacob. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, moving fast, a tall man, dressed in dark clothes, his face hardened by years of living in the wilderness. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a rifle glinted in the sunlight, slung over his shoulder. The man's eyes were sharp, calculating, as he took in the scene in front of him. Not a good idea, the stranger said in a low voice, stepping forward with caution. His gaze flicked to Jacob before settling on the wolf. You don't want to get any closer to that thing. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the man. Who are you? He asked, his voice shaky. I've been searching for Shadow. I need to know what happened to him. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on the wolf, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he finally spoke. That's not your wolf anymore. You need to turn around and leave, before you make things worse. The word stung, more than Jacob cared to admit. He had raised Shadow. He had been the one to nurture him, to teach him, to form the bond they shared. How could it be that this man, someone who had likely never seen the inside of the cage where Shadow had once been kept, could tell him what to do? "No," Jacob said, his voice growing more firm. "I'm not leaving. Shadow, he's still in there. I know him. He remembers me." The stranger's eyes darkened. "I don't know what kind of fairy tale you're living in, but the truth is that animal is more dangerous than you can imagine. I've seen what happens when someone gets too close to the wild. You can't tame it. You can't change it. Not now." Jacob felt a sinking feeling in his chest. The reality of the situation was hitting him harder than ever. Shadow wasn't the same animal he had raised. He was a creature of the wild now, a beast that no longer recognized the man who had once fed him, trained him, loved him. And yet, Jacob couldn't give up. "Not like this. I raised him," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He's still in there. I know he is." The stranger gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter what you think. You're just another person who doesn't understand. If you want to keep your life, you'll walk away. Because if you don't, that wolf, he's not going to hesitate." Jacob turned back to Shadow, his breath caught in his throat. The wolf was still watching him, its eyes now narrowing. It was a stare filled with hunger, with the sharp, primal instincts of the wild. The growl deepened, and Jacob felt a wave of fear wash over him. He had come to face the wolf he once loved, but now the fear was overwhelming. This wasn't the Shadow he knew. This was something else, something darker. "Please," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "I just want to make it right." Shadow's growl grew louder, more threatening. Jacob's heart thudded in his chest as he slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving the wolf's gaze. He had raised Shadow, but now it was clear he couldn't save him. And as Jacob took one final step back, the wolf lunged. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jacob's mind raced, his body frozen in place as Shadow's massive form shot forward. There was no time to react. The primal instinct of the wild had taken over completely. But just before the wolf reached him, there was a flash of movement, another figure stepping between them, a blur of motion that seemed to defy the chaos of the moment. The man from before had raised his rifle, pulling the trigger in one swift motion. The shot rang out, a deafening crack in the silence of the forest. Shadow stopped in his tracks, its body jerking as the bullet struck, but the wolf didn't fall. Instead, it turned, growling fiercely, blood dripping from its side. The moment was fleeting, too quick to process. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, but the pain was sharp and sudden as the reality hit him. Shadow was gone. But so was the chance for redemption. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.